October 1826, Campbelltown, New South Wales. The night hung heavy over the dirt track leading south from Patrick's Inn. John Farley walked alone, his boots scuffing the rough colonial road. He'd had a few drinks, not too many, but enough to take the edge off the day's labour. The moon hung low, casting long shadows across the paddocks that lined the route home. And then he stopped. At the corner of Fisher's paddock, where the land sloped down toward the creek, something sat on the fence rail. A figure, but bathed in a pale, unnatural light that seemed to emanate from within. Farley's breath caught in his throat. He knew that face, the distinctive profile, the way the man held himself, even sitting still on weathered timber. It was Frederick Fisher. But Frederick Fisher had left for England months ago. That's what everyone said. That's what George Worrall had told anyone who asked. The figure turned its head slowly. Blood, dark and wet, ran from a wound in the man's temple. The apparition raised one arm. Its finger extended toward a specific patch of marshy ground. And then, as Farley watched, paralysed, the figure faded. Not walking away, not disappearing behind anything. It simply dissolved into the darkness. Welcome to Struth. I'm your storyteller Mark, and this is a podcast that explores the mysteries, crimes and unexplained phenomena that have shaped Australia's cultural imagination. And today we're examining Australia's most famous ghost story. The murder at its heart is solved, maybe, but the ghost and what one man really saw or really knew on an October night in 1826? Well, that's still a mystery. This is a story of Frederick Fisher, and it's about the line between what we see and what we know. September 1816. The convict transport ship Atlas rolled through the heavy seas, approaching Port Jackson after 4 months at sea. Below decks, hundreds of convicts endured conditions barely fit for livestock. But one prisoner had something that most didn't. Frederick Fisher could read and write. He'd been born in London in 1792, the son of bookbinders. His crime was possession of forged banknotes, a capital offence in Georgian England, though his sentence was commuted to 14 years transportation. He was 24 years old when the Australian coastline first appeared on the horizon. His literacy saved him. While most convicts were assigned to road gangs or sent to work farms in chains, Fisher became a clerk for the Crown Solicitor's Office, then superintendent of the Waterloo Flour Company, the colony's most influential enterprise, run entirely by ex-convicts. He even helped launch Australia's first paper manufacturing company. And so, after years of hard work, Fisher had earned his ticket of leave. This was a form of conditional freedom for convicts. After serving part of their sentence with good behaviour, convicts could work for themselves within a specified district. They could own property, conduct their business, and live almost as free men. But they remained prisoners in a larger sense, bound to the colony and forbidden from leaving without permission, and it's this detail that will become crucial in our story. By 1825, 9 years after he landed in Australia at just 33 years old, Frederick Fisher owned 4 farms totalling over 160 acres. His main property in Campbelltown, a settlement about 53 kilometres southwest of Sydney, featured stone buildings worth £800. He'd built one of the local inns. He'd clawed his way from convict forger to a colonial success story. Picture Campbelltown in 1825. At the time it barely qualified as a town, just scattered farms connected by rough tracks and a handful of crude buildings, maybe a few hundred people total. St Peter's Anglican Church opened just 2 years earlier, and it was the most substantial structure in town. A few inns served as social centres: Patrick's Inn, the Harrow, and the Horse and Jockey, which Fisher himself had built. This was proper frontier country, remote, isolated. The journey to Sydney took a full day on horseback over terrible roads, and everyone knew everyone's business. And everyone knew their place in rigid colonial hierarchy. Society divided sharply. On one side, the exclusives, free settlers and colonial officials who'd never been convicted of anything. And on the other, the emancipists, former convicts who'd served their time, men like Fisher who could accumulate genuine wealth, but they remained socially stigmatised, and the stain of conviction never quite washed away. And it was in 1825 that Fisher had a problem. A payment dispute with a carpenter named William Brooker turned violent. Fisher attacked him with a knife. Though the assault was deemed provoked, Fisher faced months in prison. Anticipating his absence, he made a decision that would cost him his life. He granted power of attorney to his neighbour and good friend, George Worrall. William George Worrall, another convict success story, or so it appeared. He'd arrived in October 1813 serving a life sentence. And by 1823 he too had earned his ticket to leave and rented a small farm adjacent to Fisher's land. The men became close. Fisher had no house on his own property. He actually lived under Worrall's roof, sharing quarters with his servants in Worrall's substantial dwelling, 16.5 metres long, 3 large rooms, verandas. It was one of the better houses in the district, and Fisher trusted Worrall completely. When Fisher went to prison in 1825, Worrall took control of everything. Neighbours later testified that Worrall boasted openly, "It's all mine now. All that was Fred's. He gave it to me before he went to prison." Eventually Fisher was released and returned to Campbelltown. He was last seen alive on the evening of June the 17th, 1826. The next morning Frederick Fisher had vanished. When neighbours asked after him, Worrall had a simple explanation. Fisher had sailed back to England to escape potential forgery charges. He'd left in a hurry, no goodbyes, no settling of accounts. But this story had a glaring problem. As we mentioned at the top of the show, Fisher remained a convict until 1829. His ticket of leave bound him to New South Wales. Returning to England would mean immediate arrest. He'd be hanged for returning from transportation. This was serious stuff. Who would risk the gallows to flee prosecution for something relatively minor? And yet, Worrall insisted Fisher had simply gone home. Within 3 weeks, Worrall began selling Fisher's possessions, his horse, personal belongings, anything of value. He produced receipts in Fisher's handwriting, documents showing Fisher had sold these items before departing. However, local merchant James Coddington examined one of these receipts. The signature looked wrong. The handwriting seemed forced and unnatural. Suspicion rippled through Campbelltown like a stone dropped in still water. In August, James Hamilton confronted Worrall directly. Foul play was suspected. He said everyone was talking. According to later court testimony, Worrall turned pale and endeavoured to force a smile. Which ship had Fisher taken? Hamilton demanded. The Lord St Vincent, Worrall replied. But there was no ship called the Lord St Vincent. Worrall had invented a vessel that didn't exist. On September 17, 1826, 3 months after Fisher's disappearance, George Worrall was arrested on suspicion of murder. He immediately blamed 4 other men. All 5 were confined to Liverpool jail. Liverpool in Sydney, that is. But without a body, authorities couldn't proceed to trial. The Colonial Secretary published advertisements in the Sydney Gazette. £20 reward for discovery of Fisher's body. £5 for proof he'd left the colony. Days passed, then weeks. Worrall sat in jail, confident. No body, no case. And then, in October, John Farley saw the ghost. So this, of course, takes us back to the scene from the opening of the episode. John Farley, returning from Patrick's Inn on an October night, saw Frederick Fisher's dripping wet ghost sitting on a fence rail. The apparition pointed toward the creek, and then it vanished. Farley reported what he'd seen to the Reverend Thomas Reddell, the local magistrate, and within days, 2 boys named Rickson and Burrows were taking a shortcut across Fisher's old paddock. They noticed something dark on a fence rail, something that didn't belong. Dried blood. Closer examination revealed a human tooth and a lock of hair. Someone had even lit a fire beneath the rails, as if trying to burn away the evidence. The search intensified. Following the direction the ghost had pointed, searchers finally found what they were looking for near the creek that divided Fisher's property from Worrall's. 3 feet down, in a shallow grave beside the water, they found Frederick Fisher, exactly where his ghost had pointed. 4 months in the ground, the body was severely decomposed. The face was completely flattened, unrecognisable. The skull showed multiple fractures, not the result of a fall or an accident, but deliberate, savage blows. But Fisher's distinctive clothing identified him conclusively. A plum-coloured jacket, full-bloused shirt, and buckles on his braces. Frederick Fisher had been murdered, buried, and almost forgotten. His own ghost had seemingly been the one most concerned about giving him some justice. February 2nd, 1827, Sydney Supreme Criminal Court. George Worrall stood trial before Chief Justice Forbes. The courtroom was packed. This case had gripped the colony's imagination for months. The prosecution faced a significant challenge. Attorney General W.H. Moore acknowledged it openly in court. No proof exists or can any circumstances be traced to fix exactly on Worrall the actual commission of murder. Everything was circumstantial. But what circumstances they were. Lewis Solomon, a local resident, swore under oath that the receipt for Fisher's horse was forged. The handwriting was wrong, the signature was wrong. Multiple witnesses testified that Worrall had claimed Fisher sailed on the Lord St Vincent, a ship that never existed. Neighbours described Worrall's behaviour when confronted, how he turned pale, stammered, and offered contradictory explanations. And there was motive. Worrall had been living as if Fisher's property was his own, using Fisher's possessions, selling Fisher's goods, acting as if his neighbour would never return. Because his neighbour was buried 3 feet deep in marshy ground, his skull crushed. The jury retired to consider their verdict, and they only deliberated for 15 minutes. Guilty of murder. Sentence, death by hanging. Just 3 days later, on the morning of February 5th, 1827, George Worrall stood on the scaffold. Until 5 o'clock that morning he'd maintained steadfastly his innocence, and then, to a gentleman who had sat with him through the final night, he finally confessed. His explanation strained credulity. He and Fisher had been chasing a horse through a paddock, he claimed. He'd grabbed a fence paling, swung at what he thought was the animal, and when he turned around, Fisher was laying there, weltering in his blood. But no one believed it. Fisher's skull showed multiple deliberate blows, not a single accidental strike, but a sustained violent attack. The Sydney Gazette reported that his behaviour on the scaffold was manly and becoming. The drop fell, and the world closed upon this murderer forever. Justice was served. The ghost had revealed the truth. Frederick Fisher had ensured that he could rest in peace. But could he? Let's take a closer look at a few strange things about this case. According to some accounts that surfaced years and even decades later, John Farley, the man who spotted the ghost, was drinking with both Frederick Fisher and George Worrall on the night that Fisher disappeared. June the 17th, 1826, the last night anyone saw Frederick Fisher alive. If that's true, it might just change everything. It all gets a bit tricky to follow, so let's have a closer look at the timeline. On June the 17th, Frederick Fisher disappears. It's the last night he's seen alive. And according to this account, Farley was drinking with both Fisher and Worrall that night. On September 17th, 3 months later, Worrall is arrested on suspicion of murder. But there's no body, and without a body at that time, the case couldn't proceed. So Worrall sat in jail, confident that he'll walk free. In October, more than 4 months after Fisher's disappearance, John Farley is walking home from Patrick's Inn, the same inn where he supposedly drank with Fisher and Worrall that fateful night, when he sees the ghost. And the apparition, of course, points exactly to where Fisher's body is buried. So, here are the questions. Did Farley really see a ghost? Or did he know exactly where the body was? Because he'd been there the night it was buried. The last night Frederick Fisher was seen alive. The night that both he and George Worrall were drinking with Fisher in the pub. Maybe he witnessed the murder. Maybe he helped dispose of the body. Or did he simply drink too much, pass out and wake the next morning to find Fisher gone, just as everyone else in town had, and realise later perhaps what might have happened? So 4 months pass, and Farley reports seeing the ghost, a ghost that points directly to the burial site. The ghost story's brilliant cover. It's a supernatural revelation. No one can ask, how did you know where to look? Why did you go to that specific spot? What made you suspicious of that particular stretch of creek? The dead told him that's unchallengeable in a lot of respects. The police can't go and ask the questions of the ghost on the fence. Some historians have suggested an even more elaborate scenario, that someone else who knew about the murder disguised themselves as Fisher's ghost and deliberately sat on the fence rail waiting for a passerby. A calculated performance to trigger an investigation. In a tight-knit colonial community where everyone feared Worrall might escape justice, where everyone knew what probably happened but couldn't prove it, would someone stage something that theatrical just to ensure that a body was found and Worrall could be put on trial? Or what if there's a darker possibility? What if Farley helped Worrall kill Fisher? What if he was complicit in the murder itself? Maybe for money. 4 months pass, maybe Farley can't live with what he's done. Maybe the guilt is consuming him. Maybe this is a telltale heart kind of scenario. He's been watching Worrall sit in jail, about to be released, about to keep Fisher's property, and about to get away with it entirely. The ghost story gives Farley a way to direct authorities to the body without confessing his own involvement. It ensures Worrall hangs without Farley ever having to admit he was there. Decades later, when John Farley was on his deathbed, he only increased the mystery by giving two completely contradictory accounts of that October night. According to one witness, Farley swore to a man named Mr. Chisholm, "I'm a dying man. I'll speak only the truth. I saw that ghost as plainly as I see you now." A deathbed oath when a man supposedly faces his final reckoning, when lies no longer serve any purpose. But, according to another account, one that came from his own wife Margaret after his death, Farley confessed to her something entirely different. He had been drinking with Fisher and Worrall the night Fisher disappeared. The guilt of not preventing what happened, of not stopping Worrall, of knowing where the body was all along, it was the guilt that had haunted him ever since. Not Fisher's ghost. That was a lie, an invention to explain knowledge he couldn't otherwise possess. Two deathbed accounts, both supposedly true, but completely contradictory. Which one do you believe? So now let's do a bit of modern investigation to see what we can find out about contemporaneous accounts. We have a ghost story. We have Farley's conflicting deathbed accounts. We have the possibility he was drinking with Fisher and Worrall the night of the murder. Let's talk about what was actually put in print in 1826. I searched for everything I could, the newspapers, court records, the trial transcripts, everything written at the time the events actually occurred. The Sydney Gazette reports Worrall's arrest, reports the reward offer, reports the discovery of bloodstains on the fence rail, and reports the recovery of Fisher's body from the creek. However, there's no mention of any ghost, no mention of John Farley seeing a ghost. Nothing supernatural about the reporting at all. The Australian covers the coroner's inquest in detail, describes how the boys found the bloodstains, but then goes on to describe how authorities brought in Numut Gilbert, an Aboriginal tracker. This report describes how Gilbert followed traces through the marshy ground, from the blood on the fence rail, directly to the body. No ghost. The Monitor provides clinical details about the body's condition, the skull fractures, the distinctive clothing that identified Fisher, but no ghost. The trial transcripts from February 1827 present all of the circumstantial evidence that we've discussed. The forged receipts, the invented ship, Worrall's nervous behaviour, and the timing of the property sales. The prosecution presents a sequence of events. Worrall's arrested, the boys find bloodstains, Gilbert, who's mentioned again, tracks the body, there's a trial, there's a conviction. No ghost. Not one contemporary document that I could find, not one single thing written while the investigation was actually happening, mentions anything supernatural. In 1903, Scottish historian Andrew Lang examined Chief Justice Forbes's original court notes. He observed what he called a lacuna in the evidence, a gap exactly where the ghost should be, if it existed. The court records show that Worrall was arrested in September 17th, that the body was found in October 1826, after the boys discovered the bloodstains, which Gilbert then tracked to the body. But there's no explanation of why authorities were suddenly searching that specific area, why the boys happened to be crossing that particular paddock, why they looked so carefully at that particular fence rail. The first time that I could find the ghost story appearing in writing was in August 1832, 6 years after the murder. It was in a poem called The Sprite of the Creek, published in a sporting newspaper, not represented as news or an update on the case. The author was James Riley, an Irish convict, and here's a small detail that matters. Riley worked as a labourer for Reverend Thomas Reddell, the magistrate who investigated Fisher's case. Riley had access to all the local gossip, all the whispered theories, all the speculation that must have circulated through Campbelltown for years. He took that raw material and shaped it into Gothic verse, changed all the names, sure, and added some lurid supernatural detail. So did Riley invent the ghost story entirely? Or was he recording something that really happened but was deliberately kept out of official records? What I found fascinating is the absence of the ghost from contemporary documents doesn't prove it didn't happen. It might just prove that no one was brave enough to print it. Think about colonial Campbelltown in 1826, a tiny frontier settlement, rough justice. An Aboriginal tracker using traditional knowledge that colonists don't fully understand. A respectable farmer claiming supernatural visions. If Farley really did report seeing a ghost, would Reverend Reddell have written that down? Would he have put that in his official report to Sydney that the investigation was prompted by an apparition? Or would he have kept that detail very, very quiet and simply reported the bloodstains were discovered and an Aboriginal tracker located the body through traditional bushcraft? The official story that we can find in those documents is rational, scientific even, but it doesn't explain why those boys were cutting through that particular paddock on that particular day, or why they examined that fence rail so carefully to see bloodstains, or why authorities decided to bring in Gilbert. Let's think about this from a teenage boy perspective. There's ghost stories getting around town that a ghost is sitting on a very specific fence post. Of course they're going to go and have a look at it. And if they do, they're going to find the blood. Maybe someone did direct attention there. Someone who couldn't officially admit what they knew. Whatever the case, the legend lives on. Fisher's Ghost Creek still flows through Campbelltown, though it's mostly channelled as a stormwater drain now. Sections through Koshigia Park have been restored, an attempt to reclaim something of what the landscape once was. St Peter's Anglican Church still stands. Frederick Fisher was buried in the cemetery by his brother Henry. No headstone was ever erected and the exact location of his grave is now lost. George Worrall was buried there too, after his execution. Two men, former convicts, who once shared a house, now rest in the same ground, their exact locations forgotten. But the ghost? In 1956, 130 years after the murder, Sydney radio station sparked renewed interest in the legend. Around 1,500 people gathered at Fisher's Ghost Creek on an October night, hoping to glimpse the famous apparition. They waited in the darkness, watching, hoping for something impossible. Some people claimed they saw lights moving through the trees, shapes on the old fence lines, figures that shouldn't be there. Were they really seeing Fisher's ghost? Or were they seeing what they wanted to see, what they travelled hours to witness? The ghost watches continued through to the late 1950s. Fear was real. The experience was real. Whether the ghost was real, well, that's a different question. Today, the site of Worrall's house, the house where Fisher lived, the house where he was likely murdered, is the Campbelltown Town Hall Theatre. Locals say Fisher's ghost still haunts the building. Staff have reported unexplained sounds, shadows moving in empty rooms, the feeling of being watched. Objects move, and there's always cold spots. That gathering in 1956 became the Festival of Fisher's Ghost, which is still held annually every November. It's now Australia's biggest celebration of a ghost, a 10-day event drawing up to 250,000 visitors. There's street parades, art awards with $50,000 prizes, markets, fireworks. A murder from 1826 has become a carnival that continues to support the town that Frederick Fisher helped to establish. Frederick Fisher clawed his way from convicted forger to colonial success. He survived transportation, built real wealth, owned property, created something from nothing. And George Worrall murdered him for it. The evidence was circumstantial but overwhelming. The forged receipts, the non-existent ship, the nervous behaviour, the obvious lies. The jury took just 15 minutes. Worrall confessed right at the last minute, although no one believed his explanation. Fisher's skull showed multiple deliberate blows. This was murder, not an accident. And Namit Gilbert found the body, not through supernatural means, but through knowledge passed down through 30,000 years. He read the land, and in doing so detected traces of decomposition the colonists would never notice. He was claimed to have said, when he drank the water, that white fellows fat's in there. It's a practical skill, traditional bushcraft, real forensic knowledge that colonists called primitive, but which solved a case that might have remained unsolved forever. Those are the facts. But what about John Farley? That's where all the questions lie with this story. Did he see Frederick Fisher's ghost on an October night? Was it a genuine supernatural experience that directed authorities to the body? Or was he drinking with Fisher and Worrall the night Fisher disappeared? The last person to see Fisher alive apart from his murderer. Did he witness the killing, help bury the body, wake up the next morning to find Fisher gone and realise what must have happened? Did the ghost story give him cover to reveal what he'd known all along without confessing his own involvement? Or was he completely innocent? A respectable farmer who genuinely saw something impossible, something that no one wanted to put in official documents because it sounded too absurd. The absence of the ghost from contemporaneous records is interesting but proves nothing. Sometimes the most important things never get written down, especially in frontier settlements where unofficial business stayed unofficial. The first written account appearing 6 years later doesn't mean the ghost didn't exist. It just means it took a poet to put it down on paper. Maybe Riley was recording oral tradition. Maybe he was embellishing a bit. But maybe he knew the truth and disguised it in verse. These stories, ghost stories, murder mysteries, colonial tales, they're how we connect with our past. They're how we understand the country that shaped us, the convict system that built Australia, the small frontier communities where everyone knew everyone's secrets. These stories give us a chance to celebrate Namit Gilbert's genius. Traditional Aboriginal tracking wasn't primitive. It was sophisticated forensic science that predated European methods by a millennia. His knowledge, his skill, his understanding of country, that's Australian history that's worth remembering. And every time we tell Fisher's ghost story, we get to tell Gilbert's story too, and that matters. "200 years later, Frederick Fisher's ghost endures in Campbelltown, and his presence, real or imagined, supports the town in extremely tangible ways. The Festival of Fisher's Ghost, drawing 250,000 visitors, is worth a lot, and it supports community. It's culture being passed down, and maybe that's the real legacy of Fisher's Ghost. Not just a spooky story about an apparition on a fence rail, although a ghost pointing to the location of its dead body is a bloody good spooky story. It's truth. Thanks as always for listening to Struth, and thanks for all the support. Make sure you tell a friend, click follow, subscribe, whatever works on your podcasting platform. And maybe in the comments, give us your thoughts on John Farley and his involvement in this episode. Did he really see a ghost? Was he trying to clear his conscience? Make sure you tune in next week where we enter the bizarre and wonderful world of Florence Broadhurst. She shared her tea with a killer. Maybe it was even a serial killer. Could have been a business partner, a former employee. All the evidence vanished. To find out more, make sure you tune in next week to Struth.